Ava Cross never wanted to be the center of attention. Benton Springs, Missouri, was a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and that often meant they had an opinion about you. Growing up here as one of the few black kids in a place that still clung to its old ways wasn't easy. Her mother used to tell her, "Blend in, Ava. It's safer that way." And for most of her life, that was exactly what she did. Ava learned early that standing out in Benton Springs came with its own dangers. By the time she was 16, she had perfected the art of keeping her head down, avoiding too much eye contact, never lingering in places where she didn't belong. She learned to endure the whispers that followed her down the hallways and the sideways glances from people who still saw her as an outsider. She focused on school, on her part-time job at the local diner, and above all, on her grandfather, James Cross, the man who raised her after her mother passed away. James had been a Marine before becoming a boxing coach. His hands, worn from years of work, told stories that words never could. His voice was firm, his presence commanding. He never pushed Ava to fight, but he made sure she knew how to defend herself. "The world isn't fair, Ava," he would say. "You have to be ready for whatever comes your way." Every day after school and most evenings after her shifts at the diner, Ava would train in their garage-turned-gym, punching bags, footwork drills, speed exercises. She became good, really good. But fighting never felt like something she'd use outside of those walls. It was just exercise, until one Friday night when everything changed. The summer heat hung in the air like a weight, thick and stifling, as Ava finished cleaning up after a long shift at Denny's Diner. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and stepped outside, the pavement still warm beneath her sneakers. It was the same route she always took home, down Maplewood Avenue, past the old gas station, and across the narrow bridge where the streetlights flickered. The quickest way home, but it meant passing by the lot behind Baker's Auto Shop, a spot known for trouble. Ava should have turned around the moment she saw them. Ethan Doyle and his crew were leaning against an old rusted Chevy, the glow of their cigarettes cutting through the dusk. Ethan was the type of guy who always got what he wanted. His father owned half the town's businesses, and his mother chaired the local school board. That kind of power made Ethan untouchable, and for the last year, he decided Ava was his favorite target. "Hey, Cross!" Ethan's voice slurred slightly, a beer bottle dangling from his hand. His friends Gabe, Liam, and Jake snickered behind him, the sound dripping with malice. Ava didn't stop walking, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. She knew how this worked. If she ignored them, they would move on. But tonight, it felt different. Ethan stepped into her path, his grin wide and arrogant. "What's the rush, Ava? We just want to talk," he said, his words slow and slurred. Ava's stomach tightened. She could hear her grandfather's voice in her mind. "Let them think they've won, Ava. Don't show them fear." But this time, they weren't letting her go. As Ava tried to walk around him, Ethan moved with her, blocking her path again. His friends formed a loose semicircle around her, closing in. There was no way out. She exhaled slowly, reminding herself to stay calm. "I've got places to be," she said, her voice even, betraying no fear. Ethan's grin widened. "Oh, come on, Cross. Don't be rude," he said, his friends joining in with mocking laughter. Ava knew they were testing her, but she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing her scared. Ava's heart pounded as Ethan's friends circled her. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, and Ava felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before a fight. She had trained for moments like this, but it was different in real life. The stakes were higher. There was no gym, no boxing ring, no safe space to retreat to. This was just the street, the darkening evening, and four boys who thought they could get away with anything. Ethan's eyes were narrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. He stepped closer, making sure Ava had nowhere to go. "What's the matter, Cross? You too good for us now?" His voice was mockingly sweet, but there was something else behind it, something darker. Ava didn't flinch. Her breathing slowed as she assessed the situation. She knew what this was about. Ethan and his friends weren't looking for a casual conversation. They had made their intentions clear a long time ago. They wanted to break her down. They wanted to see her afraid, see her react the way they expected. But Ava wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "No, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not too good for you. I just don't have time for this." Ethan's grin faltered for a moment, but only for a second. Then it returned, sharper, meaner. He stepped forward, blocking her path once again. His breath smelled like cheap beer and cigarettes. "I don't think you understand, Cross. We're talking to you. You're being rude." Ava clenched her fists, feeling the weight of her grandfather's words in her mind. Never show fear. Let them make the first move. She had learned that lesson well. Her posture shifted, subtly but with purpose, her feet planted firmly on the ground, her shoulders relaxed but ready. She could feel the tension in her body, every muscle coiled like a spring. Ethan reached out to grab her arm, but Ava was ready. In one smooth motion, she stepped to the side, her left arm swinging up to knock his hand away. Before he could react, her right fist struck his ribs, a controlled punch that sent him stumbling back. The hit wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it was enough to make him take a few steps back, gasping for air. The other three boys froze. Ethan was staring at Ava, wide-eyed, his smug expression gone. For a moment, there was silence. No one moved. Ethan's voice was hoarse as he straightened up. "What the hell, Cross? You think you can just do that?" He lunged at her, this time full of rage but no technique. Ava easily sidestepped, feeling the heat of his anger as he barreled past her. She wasn't here to fight him for real. She just needed to defend herself, keep him off balance. She raised her elbow, bringing it down hard against the back of his shoulder. The force of the blow sent him staggering forward, tripping slightly before regaining his footing. He wasn't laughing now. Neither were his friends. "You ain't playing, huh?" Gabe muttered, stepping back, his eyes darting between Ava and Ethan. "Maybe we should just leave," Liam added, his voice uncertain. Ava kept her stance, eyes never leaving Ethan. His friends were wavering, but he wasn't done. His jaw was clenched, fists shaking at his sides. He was humiliated, and that made him dangerous. "You're not getting away with this, Cross," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. But Ava was already thinking ahead. She wasn't going to let him get close again. She could feel the moment of truth coming, the instant when the fight would truly start. Ethan, full of anger and pride, swung at her with a wild, desperate punch. It was sloppy, reckless, exactly what she had been waiting for. She stepped in, closing the distance between them. Her fist connected with his nose in a clean, sharp jab. The sound was quiet, but the impact was enough to make Ethan stagger back, his hands flying to his face, blood trickling from his nostrils. The shock on his face was more telling than the pain. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to fight back. The others stood frozen, watching. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the one in control. And that was when Ava knew it was over. Ava stood still, her breath coming in slow, measured bursts. Ethan's hands were pressed against his nose, his face twisted in shock and pain. His friends, Gabe, Liam, and Jake, didn't laugh anymore. They didn't make jokes. They didn't move. For a long moment, there was only silence, the night air thick with tension. The fight was over, but the feeling lingered, a kind of heavy anticipation that Ava couldn't shake. Ethan, his face now flushed with humiliation, staggered back, still clutching his nose. "You?" he gasped, trying to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at his friends, but they weren't looking back at him anymore. They were looking at Ava. For the first time, they were scared. Ava could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere. It was more than just a fight now. It was a challenge to everything they had ever known. Ethan Doyle wasn't used to losing, and he certainly wasn't used to losing to someone like Ava. Someone who was supposed to just take it, keep her head down, blend in. But she had done the opposite. She had fought back, and that made all the difference. The seconds stretched on, but then Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and angry. "You're gonna pay for this, Cross," he muttered, his words laced with venom. But there was something else in his voice now, something Ava recognized. Fear. He turned away, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Let's go, guys," he called, his voice still thick with anger, but there was no conviction left in it. "This ain't over." His friends hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other and then at Ava. They could see the writing on the wall. They had been part of it, part of the harassment, but they were starting to realize that this wasn't something they wanted to be a part of anymore. One by one, they muttered under their breath, and slowly, they turned and followed Ethan down the street, not daring to look back. Ava stood there, watching them disappear into the dark, her heart still pounding in her chest. She should have felt victorious, proud even, but instead, she felt something else, something heavier. The fight wasn't just over because they'd walked away. She knew this was only the beginning. When she finally turned and walked toward her grandfather's house, the weight of the night pressed against her chest. She hadn't just defended herself, she had made a statement, and statements like that always came with consequences. As she rounded the corner to her street, she saw the porch light flicker on. James Cross was waiting for her, just as he always did. She had hoped he wouldn't ask, but she knew he would. When she stepped up onto the porch, he didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. His sharp, watchful eyes scanned her face, taking in everything she didn't say. Without a word, he stepped aside to let her in. The house smelled like leather, old books, and the faint aroma of coffee, a comfort she had always known. Ava dropped her bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table, her mind spinning with what had just happened. James didn't sit. He stayed standing, arms crossed, his eyes focused on her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, his silence heavy with understanding. "You hurt them?" His question was soft but deliberate, not accusing, just seeking the truth. Ava hesitated. She didn't want to lie. "I did what you taught me," she said quietly. James nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Tell me what happened," he said. And so she did. She told him about the walk home, about the way Ethan and his friends surrounded her, about how Ethan had crossed the line, and how she defended herself when he made his move. She told him about the punch, about how the others hesitated, and how they finally backed down. When she finished, James leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just thought. "You did right, Ava," he finally said. "You defended yourself." But he paused, and Ava felt the weight of what was coming. She knew what he was going to say. "But what, Grandpa?" James exhaled slowly. "Ethan Doyle's father is a powerful man. Gerald Doyle is the kind of person who doesn't like being embarrassed. And his son? Well, he's been embarrassed, hasn't he?" Ava's stomach tightened. She already knew. She could feel it in her bones. "What happens now?" James's eyes locked onto hers, his voice steady and calm. "This ain't over." The next morning, Ava walked into Benton Springs High with her head held high, but her heart was a little heavier. She could feel the weight of the stairs as she passed through the hallways. The whispers had already begun. The moment she walked through the doors, the air in the school felt different. Students gathered in groups, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes flickering toward her every time she entered a room. Word had spread fast. Ava Cross had fought back. The story was no longer about Ethan Doyle's crew picking on her. No, it had taken on a life of its own now. By third period, the rumor mill was in full swing. Some stories had her knocking out all four of them in one go. Others had Ethan crying like a baby, humiliated and begging for mercy. Some even claimed that she had broken Ethan's nose with one punch. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was how the story was being told. It wasn't long before the first text came in. The number was anonymous, but the message was clear. "You think you're tough? Watch your back." Ava stared at the screen for a long moment, her fingers tightening around her phone. It wasn't surprising. It was exactly what she had expected. She had made a stand. And now the town's reaction was bubbling to the surface. Some would cheer for her, but most would resent her for it. By the time lunch rolled around, Ethan and his crew were nowhere to be found. The absence of his usual smug presence in the cafeteria only made the tension more palpable. Gabe and Liam sat at their usual table, but they weren't talking to anyone, not even to each other. The silence around them was deafening. Ava found herself sitting alone at the back of the cafeteria, picking at her lunch, feeling the eyes of the others on her. They weren't staring out of curiosity or admiration. No, this was something different, something colder. There was a shift in the way people looked at her now. She had gone from being invisible, a target to be bullied, to someone who had done the unthinkable. She had fought back, and that made her dangerous in the eyes of Benton Springs. When Ava got home that afternoon, the front page of the Benton Springs Gazette was waiting for her on the kitchen counter. James didn't say a word as she picked it up. He didn't need to. The headline screamed, "Local teen attacks son of prominent business leader, police investigating." Ava's stomach churned as she read the article. It twisted the facts, making her the aggressor in the situation. It quoted Gerald Doyle, Ethan's father, calling it a senseless act of violence, and saying his family was heartbroken that a young man's future could be jeopardized over what they described as a misunderstanding. Ava's hands clenched into fists as she read. It wasn't just the lies that angered her. It was the way they were painting her as the villain, the way they were protecting Ethan and his family. The story they were telling wasn't the truth. It was the version they wanted people to believe. James stood by the kitchen counter, watching her as she read. "You see what they're doing, don't you?" Ava nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "They're making me the bad guy," she said softly. James exhaled slowly, rubbing his hand over his jaw. "They'll do that. People like Gerald Doyle, they've got a lot of influence in this town. They'll twist the story however they want, and once that narrative is out there, it's hard to change." Ava's mind raced. She knew what James was saying was true. She had seen it happen before. Stories were told in one way, and the people who had power made sure they stuck. If she kept quiet, the story would stick. The town would remember her as the girl who caused trouble, but she wasn't going to let that happen. James sat down at the table, looking at her with those calm, steady eyes of his. "We've got two options, Ava. We can keep quiet, let this blow over, or..." Ava's heart was pounding now, her breath catching in her throat. She had lived her whole life avoiding conflict, avoiding trouble, doing whatever she could to blend in, to survive. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been forced to stay silent for too long. She looked at her grandfather, her resolve hardening. "I want to speak up," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. James gave her a slow nod, his face unreadable. "Then we do it right. We make them hear the truth." The news spread like wildfire by morning. Ava had known that speaking up would come with consequences, but she hadn't realized just how quickly things would spiral. The town was buzzing with opinions, the whispers only growing louder. Social media lit up, students were talking, and even the local news had picked up the story. Benton Springs, it seemed, couldn't stop talking about what had happened between Ava and Ethan. Ava sat at her desk in homeroom, staring out the window as the murmurs of her classmates buzzed around her. It was hard to focus. Every so often someone would glance her way, whispering behind their hands or just looking at her like she was a puzzle they couldn't quite figure out. The truth didn't seem to matter anymore. The stories had already taken on a life of their own, with each version more exaggerated than the last. Some said she'd knocked Ethan out with one punch. Others claimed she had broken his ribs. The rumors kept spreading, and no one seemed to care what had really happened. The hardest part was the way the town had shifted. The people who had once ignored her, who had never looked her way, were suddenly watching her. Some with admiration, others with disdain. But Ava could see it now, clearer than ever. The divide between those who were willing to stand with her and those who saw her as a threat. Then the day after the news story broke, the school called for a meeting. The gymnasium was packed with students, parents, teachers, and, of course, Ethan and his father, Gerald Doyle. Ava sat beside James, her hands clenched in her lap, trying to remain calm under the weight of 100 eyes. Gerald Doyle was the first to stand, his polished suit and controlled demeanor making him look even more imposing than usual. His voice carried across the room as he addressed the crowd. "Our family has always supported Benton Springs. We've invested in this town. We believe in second chances. But my son was unfairly attacked, and now his reputation is suffering because of lies. We just want accountability," he said smoothly, his eyes briefly flicking to Ava. Ava could feel the crowd's gaze shift toward her, some faces unreadable, others openly hostile. She could see the way some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to believe. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't hesitate. Ava stood tall, despite the heavy weight pressing against her chest, and stepped up to the microphone. "For a year, Ethan Doyle and his friends have harassed me," she said, her voice unwavering. "They've cornered me, insulted me, thrown things at me. That night, they surrounded me and I defended myself." There was a pause, the silence hanging thick in the air. Ava continued, her voice growing stronger. "If I were the one who lost that fight, would we even be having this conversation right now?" The question landed with a quiet but undeniable force. Ava could see the hesitation in some of the faces around her. They hadn't expected her to speak so plainly, so directly. Gerald Doyle opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, James stood and addressed the room. "The real question," he said, his voice calm and steady, "is if Ava were a white girl and Ethan was the one attacking her, would you still call it a misunderstanding?" Ava's heart raced as the room went silent. She could see it, the cracks in the story. People were starting to question it, starting to look at the situation differently. She had said her piece, and now it was up to them to decide whether they wanted to hear the truth. Then the tension in the room shifted. A voice broke through the silence. "She's right." Mrs. Delgado, the math teacher, stood with her arms crossed, her voice firm. "If that had been my daughter getting attacked, we wouldn't be debating this." The room seemed to collectively exhale, the air suddenly lighter. Heads nodded, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Then another voice spoke up. It was Jennings, a junior who had clashed with Ethan in the past. "Colton's been a bully for years," he said. "We all know it." The tide was turning. Gerald Doyle's face tightened with anger, but he couldn't silence the voices rising against him. Just when it seemed like the room might erupt, Colton stood. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked a lot like regret. "I started it," he said quietly. "I lost. That's it." Ava's eyes widened slightly as she saw Colton's confession. The room was still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Gerald Doyle's face turned red, his fists clenched at his sides. But Colton wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes flickered briefly toward Ava before he lowered his head and left the room. And just like that, the power shifted. The crowd was no longer on Ethan's side. James gave Ava's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You did good, baby girl," he said softly, and for the first time, Ava felt it. She hadn't just defended herself that night. She had forced the town to confront its own biases, its own flaws. She had made them see the truth. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always safe. But in that moment, Ava knew something had changed. People like Gerald Doyle would always try to control the narrative, but people like her would always be there to remind the world that truth has a way of fighting back.